Nice evening to all of you. Welcome to tonight's event on cultures of rejection in the COVID-19 crisis. My name is Benjamin Opratko. I'm a postdoc researcher at the Department of Political Science at the University of Vienna. Well, really, I'm in my living room, as are most people, I guess, these days. I'm also a member of the Cultures of Rejection research group, which has organized this meeting. It's the second public meeting that we've organized. The first took place in Linköping, actually Norrköping in Sweden, a little more than a year ago. The project itself is, I should mention, generously funded by the Volkswagen Stiftung, the Volkswagen Foundation. And if you're interested in more about the project, I can only encourage you to check out the website www.culturesofrejection.net. Before we start with this event and before I start introducing all the participants, I would just like to inform you that we are recording this event. To those of you joining us via the email link, you have registered for the event. You are in this format not able to open your mics or your camera, but we will have an open discussion a little later, and you will be able either to post questions or comments through the chat, which you will find on the very bottom of your screen, or if you would rather like to speak directly to us or to one of the speakers, then you can also just indicate that, and we will open the mic then for you. So without further ado, we are very pleased to have two distinguished guests tonight, Eva von Redecker and Richard Seymour, who will present some of their thoughts on the relationship between cultures of rejection, authoritarianism on the one hand, and the current crisis induced by the COVID-19 pandemic. Before we listen to them, however, we will start by a brief introduction really into the topic by two of the research group's members, Birgit Sauer and Stefan Jonsson. Birgit is a professor of political science at the University of Vienna, and Stefan is a professor at the Institute for Research on Migration, Ethnicity and Society, REMESO, at Linköping University in Sweden. So Stefan and Birgit, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so also a very warm welcome from my side, and thanks Benjamin for the introduction. And my task is to very briefly introduce the concept of cultures of rejection and how we use it in our joint research. So the concept cultures of rejection allows us to investigate sociocultural conditions in which authoritarian, right-wing populist politics have become acceptable over the last 10 years. And using the concept, we first, of course, want to illuminate and pay attention to existing research on right-wing extremism and populism. But secondly, we would like to give this research a sort of new twist and have it or approach it with a different concepts. So cultures of rejection, so this concept aims at connecting the emergence and rise of the radical right, of nationalist, racist, and sexist mobilization, not only to larger transformation of economy, society, labor markets, or party landscapes, but this concept connects these transformations to a specific understanding of culture. So, and the project's notion of culture takes into account several elements. It takes into account institutions, structures of power, structures of feeling, for instance, fear and anger, but also practices of, for instance, homemaking, but also practices of creating a public, in, for instance, transforming gender relations. So our notion of culture combines the material and everyday conditions of living with feelings of people, with thoughts, with activities and practices. And all these elements of culture, although they are contradicting, nevertheless articulate with a sort of temporal specificity. And this means the temporal specificity is the background of recent transformations and crises. These cultures create a sort of articulation, or they articulate in specific ways against these backgrounds. And the project there refers to Stuart Hall's concept of conjuncture. So we think of the emerging culture or cultures of rejection as specific conjunctures of rather different elements, institutions, practices, actors, feelings, etc. So the recent conjuncture builds, of course, on the background of these conditions of transformations, and then creates what we like to focus on in the project, on the acceptability of rejections. And in our empirical work, we focus on workers in areas which are challenged by precarity, always or already pre-COVID, precarization. This precarization is due, for instance, through digitalization of their work, and we focus namely on retail and more infrastructural work. And what we do, we try to look at these workers' attitudes, their opinions, their everyday practices at the workplace, but also in other social areas. And we are interested in the objects or in the targets of what they reject. We are first interested how they communicate these rejections, how they create the objects of rejections, and how they create a sort of others. But we are also secondly interested how this creation of others is connected to a sort of negative perspective on authorities, so be it the state, be it science, be it media, for instance. And just a preliminary finding from Austria, we found that one of these targets of rejections is the welfare state, which is perceived as maldistributive, as giving money and goods to those who do not deserve. Also, what we found so far is that the public sphere is perceived as a dangerous sphere, while a lot of our interviewees see their homes as a sort of safe haven. And this was already before the COVID-19 crisis. So overall, the notion of cultures of rejection helps us to understand the modalities in which these transformations, the recent transformations of work, but also the private sphere, are experienced in these contexts of multiple crises and how they are lived in the everyday life. And the Croatian team called this endeavor, what we want to do with this notion of cultures of rejection, as the political dimension of the concept. So we think that it's ultimately political to look how people experience crises and transformations. And of course, we are interested when we think about rejection and cultures of rejection, as I said before, how different conjunctures of racism or of sexism or anti-genderism are emerging in these times of crisis. And now I'll turn the word to Stefan, and he'll go a little bit into our research during the COVID-19 crisis.
My name is Stefan Jonsson, and I'm pleased to address you from Sweden, from Linköping University. So I will try to connect this to what Birgit just said to a few minutes on the COVID-19 and cultures of rejection. I mean, one advantage, as Birgit mentioned, with this concept, as we see it, is that it allows us to see coherence in variety or chaos, and see patterns of reactions and between passions and work and labor. And we could, I mean, the evening being the evening it is, we could talk about the current events in the US and talk about how, in fact, I think cultures of rejection would be able to tell us something about the unity that is currently bringing US democracy, or the formal democracy there, into its deepest crisis in many decades. But we are also experiencing a pandemic, and this is what we are going to talk about this evening. And I will start with a very simple point. Pandemic being a noun deriving from an adjective which describes something that it involves pan-demos, that is, all people. Indeed, the SARS-CoV-19 virus is a global virological and biological process with global biopolitical effects. But it's interesting then to see from our point of view how this global process has been lived, managed, and understood. And I think a striking feature, which, I mean, you don't need a research project to see it, but one thing that we have written about, and that is that the cultural, ideological, and political response to the corona disease is of a national character. It's very much what we would call a COVID chauvinism. From the outset, the World Health Organization was sidelined in the reporting about this, and responses have been predominantly nation-state based, which has meant little international collaboration, but closed borders and blame games. The Chinese virus, the Austrian ski resorts, or the Italian ones, the Swedish irresponsibility, and so on and so forth. And there's even been a certain self-congratulatory pleasure involved in seeing that so many people in this or that nation have been struck or even died from the disease, as long as it is another nation. There has been a silly mentality of counting and comparing, a competition that has prevailed in the debate and the argument around this. And now we also see that this attitude is transposed into the area of vaccinations. whose vaccine is the best one and which nation's health authorities are the fastest ones and so on. So the COVID-19 crisis is thus, it is a crisis of globality and internationalism on an ideological and political level. And it's a crisis which reveals the extent to which over the past few years or decades, the nation has been reasserted and reestablished as a natural frame of reference for our social and political imagination and for our passions. Should this be seen as a regression? Undoubtedly, yes. And from our point of view in the research project, it also proves the existence, I think, of a general pattern of rejection of the outside world, of the supranational, as being distant, irrelevant, or threatening, and a concomitant embrace of the nation state as the natural biopolitical unit within which power can be wielded, health and welfare preserved, and the pandemic presumably be defeated. From our point of view, the COVID-19 crisis discloses that cultures of rejection now saturate our societies so fully that patterns of rejection even dominate our public European culture in general. And in this sense, many reactions to the COVID-19 crisis can be seen as symptomatic of cultures of rejection. The COVID-19 crisis can be characterized by a sense that it does not affect, the pandemic does not affect all people as much as it affects my people. This is also to say that it is an excellent indicator of the ways in which cultures of rejection seem to function, but also of how in times of crisis they can be transformed. And I'll give you a few examples of processes that we are thinking about. One is that the COVID-19 crisis has revealed how cultures of rejections are animated by a general sense of being besieged or locked down, which is rationalized by the assertion of the need to protect oneself against external and internal threats. Another thing is that culture of rejections also function through a process of contagion taking place in social media. Contagion not of viruses, but of ideas. A third point is that cultures of rejection operate in relation not just to external and internal perceived or real threats, but through an anxious fixation on authorities. This fixation sucks up most political passions to the effect that the public debate is mainly characterized by outbursts of support for or aggressions against this or that real or imagined center of command and control. Social passions are structured hierarchically rather than horizontally, which explains why they also become these cultures of rejection, why they become favorable to authoritarian and fascist forms of political organization. Cultures of rejection also operate through suspicion and competition against what is perceived as non-national, to the effect that anything foreign can be stigmatized and subject to hatred, boycott, fear, and violence. And here the immigrant is always the basic and most frequent figure of this. And finally, cultures of rejection operate through a sense of anxious care and love for the nation, or the community, or the family, or any other group defined as one's own, all of which are taken to be so fragile. And this is also something that has come across in this COVID-19 crisis, that even the most severe forms of rejection and violence will tend to be seen as motivated and justified in the name of one's own group. So to sum up, the pandemic reveals and is a catalyst for social interactions of a kind where many are bound to react as the characters in Jean-Paul Sartre's 1944 crisis drama, Huis clos, translated into English as No Exit, and into German as Geschlossene Gesellschaft, but literally meaning locked gates. And as Sartre famously states in this play, hell is other people. During the COVID-19 crisis, we have also seen abundant examples of all of the above, but we should be grateful that we have also seen other reactions which counteract COVID chauvinism. Most of these alternatives derive from international organizations and forms of cooperation. They are animated by cultures of liberalism, cultures of solidarity, and cultures of protest, which have institutionalized ways in which to overcome the psychopolitical patterns of rejection that characterize so many emerging and expanding tendencies in today's right-wing landscape. But as Sartre knew, there is only one way to get out of the hell that consists of other people, and that is to recognize the other as oneself. Thanks.
Thank you very much to Stefan and to Birgit for these very, very provocative, I think, insights. And I would like to ask Eva to jump in at this point. Eva von Redecker, as most of you will probably know, is a critical theorist, a public philosopher. She has published most recently in German Revolution für das Leben, Revolution for Life, which has sparked quite a lot of political and intellectual debate in the last year. Her book Praxis and Revolution is forthcoming in English with Columbia University Press this summer, I think. We are very happy to have her with us tonight. Oh, there it is. Revolution für das Leben. It made it
oh my God.
all the way up to Linköping, among other places. Eva will talk about COVID denial and the recovery of phantom possession. So Eva, thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. It's great, and I will start straight away. The German sociologist Oliver Nachtwey has recently published a survey on corona protesters, self-defining as lateral thinkers, those protesters, or in German Querdenker. They turn out to be middle-aged, rather well-educated, no more right-wing or authoritarian than the societal average, yet beset by distrust in government, media, and scientific expertise. Nachtwey concludes his study with the following sentence, which I'll quote. One might, however, reverse the perspective and ask what kind of society it is that produces this kind of movement, and what are its structural conditions. So he's doing the same thing that your research project is anyway already doing. This would be the perspective of critical theory, and the Frankfurt School in particular. Perhaps most famously, this perspective informed the studies in authoritarian personality conducted, amongst others, by Theodor Adorno. The hypothesis I will share in the following try to be faithful to this question. What kind of society produces the cultures of rejection in the COVID-19 crisis? Rejections of our government's half-hearted attempts to contain the virus. And I'm speaking mostly for Germany here. I will be slightly less faithful to the theory of society guiding Adorno's own approach. Adorno followed George Lukács in putting the commodity form center stage in his analysis, if in a more fractured and culturalist vein than most orthodox Marxists would. I add to this model somewhat promiscuously by drawing from accounts of racial capitalism, such as Cedric Robinson's, and patriarchal accumulation, such as Silvia Federici's. Central to these accounts is not so much the homogenization and equivalence that Frankfurt accounts of capitalism talk so much about, but the splitting which capitalist modes of reproduction procure. Two splits are crucial in order to understand modern societies, identities, and cultures of rejection. The split between subject and object of ownership, and the split between exchange value and debris in commodity production. I talk about that much more in the book, and now it's actually the first time that I bring that to Corona protests, so you can definitely help me make that thinking better. The rejection of anti-infection measures, I want to argue, can be mapped onto those splits. I will sketch two core characteristics of the affective dynamics and political rhetorics of lateral thinkers. I call them 1, recuperation of phantom possession, and 2, manic fusion. The first maps onto the tension born by the liberal notion of freedom as self-ownership. The second maps onto the painful isolation that liberal individualism and a fortiori capitalist competition bring about. Before I start properly, is this all okay with the audibility and stuff? Because we didn't have a technology check. Okay, can't do anything about the accent, I'm sorry. So, recuperation of phantom possession, 1. Freedom is one of the core reference points of the COVID-19 protests. Freedom, freedom is a frequent chant at demonstrations across Germany. It is printed on placards, banners, and other accessories. The sociologist Christina Henschel describes in a paper a hat onto which freedom and autonomy was stitched. What does freedom stand for here? Or what does it show about late capitalist liberal democratic societies that this is what freedom ends up standing for? From early modern contract theorists to millennial self-optimization manuals, freedom is understood as self-ownership. The rights-bearing individual, presumed by liberalism and by market transactions, belongs to no one but themselves. Self-ownership was a gain in emancipation, be it from pre-modern forms of servitude or from modern forms of domination, such as chattel slavery or patriarchal gender relations. Materialist critics usually point out the insufficiency of formal liberation without material basis. But I want to highlight a related insufficiency, more familiar from intersectional feminist critiques. Human animals can never sensibly be said to belong just to themselves. And therefore, this whole notion of self-ownership very easily tips into the urge to control others. Ownership, in its modern form, promises full volitional freedom, not just choice, but total and exclusive control over the object owned. It's called absolute dominion in legal terms, which means that owning something always comes with the right to destroy it, something that Daniel Leuk has brought into critical theory in Germany very prominently. This license, the license to destroy, is the core of the ownership title, even as in practice, many tedious regulations stop us from fully exercising destructive volition when it comes to listed buildings, pets, or wives. It isn't just regulations, however, which undercut full control. It's something about the quality of many objects, including our own bodies. Try to be fully sovereign over that, and you will taste defeat. Yet the history of propertization, i.e. of converting aspects of the world into ownable things, nevertheless expands beyond easily manageable, clearly delineated inanimate objects. Its frontier is pushed forward by colonial conquest, capitalist extraction, and exploitation. Propertization follows the resource hunger of the powerful, but propertization is also driven by the freedom hunger of the unpropertied. As per rights-bearing personhood, they are, however, supposed to equally be self-owning individuals. European populations rendered landless through enclosures, rootless through urbanization, and timeless through wage labor were and are compensated with ideological objects. In order for broader masses to taste the freedom of the owner, a freedom so hard to experience when it comes to just one's own laboring body, other bodies needed to be reified. So as historic examples of that, we can turn to the tightening of marriage law in the 17th century, where reproductive capacity, sexual accessibility, gestation, nurture were turned into property of husbands, extracted from wives and fenced in by the modern heteronormative cisgender regime. The ultimate propertization of human life was enforced through the institution of chattel slavery. The property status pertained to the whole person of enslaved Black people. It restricted mobility, kinship, reproduction, and it enabled commodification. White supremacy was built on this form of dominion, but normal liberal freedom needed it too. Only against the contrast of persons ultimately stripped of their freedom or of one's own group in the past oppressed, can the burdened individuals, as Saidiya Hartman calls them, of self-ownership figure as free and endowed with self-ownership. So having a domain in which to exercise absolute volitional freedom, including the license to harm, and not being owned oneself, is the pinnacle of freedom in liberal capitalist societies, at least if this genealogy is correct, and I elaborated a bit better elsewhere. Paradoxically, the best way to demonstrate one's freedom, to demonstrate that one isn't oneself owned, is precisely to wreak harm, to activate that right to abuse. The official story of liberal freedom posits others as the barriers to my own freedom, and worst case as hell in Sartre. The less official history of modern dominion, meanwhile, reminds us that some people and some other animals were always needed to provide freedom's ground. Self-ownership of some needs an outer domain as its supplement, so that self-owners can feel their freedom. The other, who figures as barrier, is to be trampled down. Formally, our societies have, of course, abolished all forms of institutionally warranted dominion over others. The barriers are erect and propped up by anti-discrimination law. But this does not mean that the internalized entitlement to abusive disposal has ceased. Privileged subjects, shorn of their domains of dominion, feel amputated. They cultivate phantom possession. Phantom possession is what I call the lingering disposition to appropriate. It was trained in a long history of domination, but it is also provoked by the urge to fill that gap between the promise of self-ownership like freedom and its precarious base in nothing but oneself. Moreover, phantom possession is the time-proven ideological remedy for material losses, for that kind of frustration that capitalist and punitive societies systematically inflict on their members. Many of the precautions for pandemic control, distance keeping, mobility reduction, but most of all wearing the mask, offer something like a new barrier to self-ownership. Hence, breaking them might reassure one of one's freedom. It is my face, so I should be able to do what I want with it. And how do I ever know I really do what I want? I'm really acting freely. How do I prove worthy of that hat with freedom and autonomy stitched onto it? One way is to defy that rule, expose my mouth, and use my breath to harm. It's mine, after all. If this is the unconscious thrall of volitional freedom, then the rationalization of asserting it is driven from the other end. A hysteric fear of being put oneself in the position of object of dominion. The sociologist Christina Henschel has continuously monitored the Corona protests in Hamburg and made additional field trips to the bigger demonstrations elsewhere. And I think we might actually be so fortunate as to have her amongst us in the audience. At the big march in Berlin on August 29th, which led to an attempted storming of the Reichstag, Germany's parliamentary building, approximately 40,000 lateral thinkers came together. Henschel describes a group of protesters on that day gathered for a picnic under a placard reading, "Slave wears mask." She also reports of a flyer campaign which circulated the image of a woman with a metal cage around her mouth. The caption read, "Did you know? In colonial Brazil, Masks were used to torture slaves. The mistake of the lateral thinkers is not to think that we are somehow unfree. Their mistake is to assess our freedom on the scale of self-ownership and then grotesquely equate their own position with that of ultimate victimization on that very scale. The one thing even more effective than self-victimization is the mobilizing around the suffering of children. According to the survey by Oliver Nachtwey and his team at Basel University, 88% of lateral thinkers agree with the statement that the duty to wear a mask is child abuse in those terms. Finally, the widespread fear of registration, crystallizing in conspiracies around microchips injected with vaccines, likewise collapses social control into alleged slavery. That's the language in which it's discussed. It culminates in a conspiracy theory around Bill Gates, ironically, the tech magnate who's least involved in the actual business of extracting and exploiting data. The danger of enslavement, of course, warrants violent self-defense. Defending the phantasmatic property in one's body simultaneously fulfills this desire to feel individually sovereign. For one fleeting moment, the rejection of quarantine measures recuperates the impossible phantom possession in oneself. What could be barriers making our encounters safe are refused as alleged props of slavery. That's the first part on the phantom possession. Now there's the last shorter part on what I call manic fusion. And that's not mobilizing around freedom, but mobilizing around love. Intensive care units are overflowing. People suffocate in care homes. We actually have one of the worst hit care homes in Germany in the next town here. And they didn't even separate the infected ones from the not infected ones in the double rooms because of scarce resources. Everyone in the medical sector is close to burnout, but instead of admitting or even trying to solve these problems, lateral thinkers hug on the streets. Denying the dangers of infection might account for some of the giddiness of the actual protests. But this denial, I want to suggest, allows for further relief too. They hug, as it were, with a vengeance. And this is not a vengeance against the barriers and the regulations alone. It's not just a defense of phantom possession as I reconstructed in the first part. It is a vengeance against the capitalist life lived in isolation, even when no quarantine measures apply. A vengeance against the performance principle, which teaches us to see the other as competitor and our bodies as potential traders. Marx called this illusionary kind of overcoming, this episodic bracketing of reality, a crude negation, regression, not revolution. Christina Henschel reports that love and the incantation against splitting is the primary self-articulation of the protests, at least as ubiquitous as the, on the face of quarantine measures, more obvious appeal to freedom. Liebe, Liebe is shouted in the face of counter-protests and police alike. Sitting protesters draw heart-shaped chalk lines around themselves. And the heart signal with your hands is one of the ways in which the members of the lateral thinkers recognize themselves. In the hymn of the protests, which proliferated in May, and being sung, again, uses the breath to carelessly spread the virus, splitting is the ultimate crime of the elite. Translated, it says, you have split this country between left and right, black and white, young and old. You control the thoughts. Our opinion has to fit. By divide and conquer, you control the masses. That's the COVID protesters against the government. The sugary hippie style of the protests is not an embarrassing side aspect. It is their core. With Melanie Klein, we could speak of manic reparation. That is, in her vocabulary, the baseless attempt to bridge ambivalence. The more solid resolution of ambivalence is a process of mourning, sobering, and integration, according to Klein. It's about, like, there's some analogy to the dialectical resolution of social contradictions. Yes, that monster and that Madonna are both your mother. She's human, love hurts. Yes, that risk of infection and that promise of solidarity are both your social nature. Manic reparation instead desperately denies such ambivalence and proclaims its object against better knowledge as unscathed and intact. No, 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 she's holy. No, 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 we are all one, and we do not even need to differentiate from the Nazis in our midst. So that's especially in Germany, there's this unholy alliance of the really far right and the newly turning right, and partly even quite left-wing Corona protesters. Lateral thinkers are manic reparators of a society ill-stricken by virus and of an economy paused for distancing's sake. They insist on fusion, and in the face of a stubbornly contradicting reality, they are quick to follow whichever narrative names the forces that are in the way of union, most often a conspiracy of Jews or lately of pedophile elites, a vampiric force at any rate. It has to be hidden, not only to make the refutation harder, but also to match, in however grotesque distortion, the reality. So the ideology, according to Adorno and more recently Rahel Yegi, always has that grain of truth in it, otherwise it wouldn't hold. Capital rules, as Marxists know, in anonymous, impersonal form. It is invisible. You might even call it a vampire, sucking living life and labor and transforming them into dead return. Pandemic control lights up the grid by which modern nation states parcel us all into contactless individual units, catered for by those who are not fortunate enough to count as worthy of protection. Everyone stay at home, yet keep working, but without associating with their co-worker. Corona protests do not attack that grid. Quite to the contrary, a lot of them fervently wish our economy to roll out unhindered. They attack the lights, turning them into will-o'-the-wisp for real emancipation. Real emancipation, Benjamin has just written a book on that, fortunately, is something very hard to do, something that requires a revolution of reappropriation and depropertization. But there is something that our societies could have done, even without abolishing capitalism first. We could have paused properly, provided everyone with the means to isolate, squash the curve instead of flattening it, and treat the vaccine as a global commons. That would have meant resolving at least one crisis. As things stand, we have the plague and its deniers. Or if my analysis is correct, we have the plague, and the plague allows its deniers to recuperate phantom possession and to manically fuse splits, thus to continue the denial, which they share with the rest of us. That we'd be healthy without the plague and not bereft and divided. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva. Thanks for sharing these really fascinating insights and analyses. And from what I've heard, it's also the first time that you actually shared this particular idea with us and with what we might call a phantom audience, which consists of more than 80 people. I was just going to mention that because we don't see them, unfortunately, at this point. So next up is Richard Seymour, who is, as you might well know, a prolific writer based in London, author most recently of The Twittering Machine. He's also the founding editor of Salvage magazine, which has, I think, just published its most recent issue. So Richard, there you go.
Thank you. So let me begin with big data. And it's no secret now that we, all of us, are surrounded by, covered with, infected by, and in living symbiosis with trillions upon trillions of particles of data. This is what viruses are, or as Sir Peter Medawar put it in his philosophical dictionary of biology, a piece of bad news wrapped up in protein. So this is the microcosmos that Lynn Margulis has been talking about. In the symbiotic planet, she writes, we are all in mute, incontrovertible partnership with the photosynthetic organisms that feed us, the mass producers that provide oxygen, and the heterotrophic bacteria and fungi that remove and convert our waste. No political will or technological advance can dissolve that partnership. So particle politics, it turns out, is the politics of life, biopolitics. And therefore, I want to look briefly at the ways in which capitalist biopolitics and the militarization of pandemic responses and right-wing nationalism and denialism are all related. Our microbial repertoire includes, obviously, many particles that would have jumped to humans from animals a long time ago as we hunted and then domesticated them, meaning we adapted to those particles. So they become harmless to us. Yet the number of non-adapted harmful particles is vastly greater than our existing repertoire. There are apparently 5,000 species of mammal to 1 species of human, meaning that the viral reservoir is actually huge. So any constellation of human forces which enables the zoonotic leap of viral or microbial organisms from animals to humans can be called virulent. Global trade, high-speed transit, agribusiness, or if we really want to be concise, capitalism. Capitalist practices, as Andreas Malm demonstrates in his wonderful new book, are themselves virulent forces. As David Quammen puts it in Spillover, ecological disturbances causes disease to emerge. Shake a tree and things fall out. Capitalist biosecurity abbreviates this discussion. In the biosecuritarian register of epidemiologists and other disease specialists, the problem is humanity and its relationship to particles. Thus, the problem is one of how to track pathogens on the human-animal frontiers and then to manage popular behavior, which is usually interpreted as herd behavior. Capitalist biosecurity draws on counter-terrorism rhetoric, the language of viral chatter, which is used by epidemiologists, deliberately echoing the language of terrorist chatter, which is used by intelligence specialists. So it's an intelligence program, an intelligence problem to be resolved with better surveillance, big data, and geographic information systems. The British government's pandemic management has been guided from the outset by this combination of behavioral psychology and big data, and its Joint Biosecurity Centre, which is led by the government's pick to head MI5, is modelled on the Joint Terrorism Analysis Centre. The goal is to find, as Foucault once said of biopolitics, a bandwidth of the acceptable. The language of preparedness, which is underpinned in international organization and law by the World Health Organization and the international health regulations. The latter were the international health regulations that were developed in the late 19th century to manage international epidemic responses, quarantining, cooperation, etc., without unduly impacting trade and transit. That was a very important rationale for the laws, to make sure that trade and transit continued to work, and therefore capital accumulation continued. These laws, which are barely altered since they were first written, are today integrated into World Health Organization governance under the rubric of global health security. Now, these are military metaphors. The language of preparedness, for instance, derives from Cold War nuclear discourse and was indeed a Cold War terminology before it was fused with disaster management, relief management, and so on in the 1990s, becoming what it's become today. And as Susan Sontag pointed out in her book, AIDS and Its Metaphors, the militarization of illness has really profoundly worrying effects. Now, on the one hand, militarization is the only situation that capitalism can tolerate in which not everything is calculated in terms of profit, the only situation that favors zealous, imprudent zeal and sacrifices. But the danger is that by treating particles as these menacing others, these alien figures, we actually treat human beings that way. Because after all, it's human beings who are subject to lockdown. It is human beings who are color-coded and tiered by threat level and policed and so on. And certainly historically, it was human beings who were stigmatized on the basis of having an illness, for example, AIDS, of course. And yet it would be a mistake to assume that an actual war, or even a metaphorical war, in a manner of speaking, is being fought. The point of global health security, contra agambum, is not to impose a state of emergency. It is an attempt to integrate emergencies caused, in this case, by capitalist encroachments on the viral reserves of nature into the smooth functioning of capitalism. It is a technocratic category. Global health security failed in the case of Ebola and Zika, and unsurprisingly has failed in the case of coronavirus. Nonetheless, this exiguous biosecurity infrastructure, which has been linked to the Pentagon's DARPA system, and of course the World Health Organization, are greatly underfunded, will probably become the spine of a greatly expanded global system. So this is the means of management that we can look forward to. Before I go on to point out the limits of the military metaphor, let me again point up its dangers. If you look, for example, at the Indian government and how it responded to the plague in its country, they invoked a piece of colonial era legislation called the Epidemic Diseases Act. That is a piece of legislation that was as much about population control in the context of Indian insurgency as it was about managing a disease that the British government ruling then, knew little about. And it used that colonial era legislation to, yes, control the plague, but to do so in a way that ratcheted up an already high level of repression, and which was very useful in the aftermath of the mass protests against, for example, the Citizenship Amendment Act. This is clearly an example of politics as war by other means. And yet, with some exceptions, that has not been the dominant way in which pandemic authoritarianism, nationalism, and securitarianism has manifested itself. And I want to move on then to draw attention to the cluster of aggressively nationalist forces aroused by the prospect of annihilation. They've been thriving for years on wholly imaginary crises and disasters. White genocide, FEMA concentration camps, the Great Replacement, Chinese climate hoax, Satanist pedophiles, Islamization, the Jews who will not replace us. I call this disaster nationalism. But faced with a real crisis, with one that surely indicates the need to go to war, to ruthlessly, in other words, appropriate whatever resources are necessary, to unify and centralize the state, to conscript the population, to shut down borders, to control capital and limit air travel, all of these measures that you would think authoritarian nationalists would be profoundly drawn to, disaster nationalism at best prevaricated. Trump and Bolsonaro, for instance, were not more eager to shut borders or limit air travel or the flow of goods than their opponents. Rather, their reflex was a form of denialism akin to their climate denialism. And this is all the more surprising since the nationalist terms of art today are protection, security, and control. If anything, the most aggressive right-wing nationalists have rejected social distancing and lockdown measures not as an opportunity for a national fusion in struggle, but as covert communism. And far from unifying the state, they have opened up several lines of antagonism and culture war within the polity, from the executive to the legislature to regions and localities. And far from appropriating whatever resources are necessary and mobilizing the population to the maximum, they have tried as far as possible to persuade people to get back to work. It's as if they fear they're being lured into fighting the wrong war by these wet medical bureaucrats, the wrong war without an adequate theodicy or an adequate friend-enemy distinction. Certainly there have been attempts to inject a friend-enemy distinction, as with the Hindu rights blaming of Muslims for a so-called corona jihad, or Alessandro Mussolini and Trump's attempt to blame a Chinese lab for creating the virus. By and large, however, social resentment has been easier to organize around denialism, the plandemic, 5G conspiracy theories, and so on. Now, there are different levels of denialism that are relevant here. Stanley Cohen, of course, gives us the three registers. There's literal hard denial, which refutes the facts, COVID hoax. There's interpretive denial, where you accept the facts but insist they don't mean what they appear to. It's just a bit of flu. There's implicatory denial, where you accept the facts and the interpretation but resist the political and moral implications thereof. Lockdowns don't work. Hard denialism has been disruptive with regard to capitalist biopolitics. So, for example, Trump's obstruction prevented early efforts by the G7 to agree a statement because he insisted on calling the disease the Wuhan virus. Yet the greatest damage was actually done to national coherence. Trump's standoffs with the states imposing lockdown restrictions, indeed with his own coronavirus task force, echo and mimic Bolsonaro's standoffs with local governors over the use of lockdowns and of Chinese-made vaccines. In this respect, though, disaster nationalism hasn't been so very far from other governments more committed to a conventional biosecuritarian response. It is characterized only in this sense by the belligerence of its demands that we get back to work and that perhaps we should let the weak and elderly die, that indeed they would be glad to die so that the young can enjoy capitalist freedom. Some of you will have seen the sort of queues of Republican politicians lining up to say that in the United States. They accentuate, and of course in the same prospect, reduce to a horrible caricature, a temptation that has been very evident in the majority of the world's governments. Now, why don't disaster nationalists want to go to war? Why do they want not the state of exception, but the state of business as usual? There may be a few ideological reasons. There is, of course, the sociophobia of the far right in the context of a crisis of authoritative knowledge. Sociophobia in the sense that they regard appeals to society as in some sense oppressive, as menacing, as onerous, and wherein, of course, these digitally managed subjects prefer to discover the truth about things by forming loose vigilante investigation groups from 9/11 Truth to QAnon. There's intense distrust of appeals to the social because they are equated with a form of totalitarian oppression, hence masks are muzzles. In another sense, biopolitics has an inclusionary dimension that isn't particularly useful to the far right, insofar as governments committed to pursuing it have been forced, often reluctantly, to mitigate some of the virulence of market failure, poverty, imprisonment, and certain violent abstractions like race. They've been forced, again, reluctantly to implement things like wage subsidies and to prioritize the collective over even such things as accumulation and property rights. However, the most important aspect of today's disaster nationalism is that its main promise is to liberate the capitalist dynamism of their respective nation states, which are mainly upper middle income states, which are upwardly mobile, but with some maldistributed wealth and fragile democratic systems, alongside downwardly mobile rich states with the same sorts of problems. Now, they can liberate that dynamism and solve problems of development and growth, they claim, by throwing off in a macho fashion the feminizing, domesticating, emasculating constraints of liberal legality, which stop us from doing what is necessary to succeed, human rights norms, which allow drugs to ruin poor communities, that's Duterte's excuse in the Philippines, leftist gender ideology, which weakens families, climate restrictions, which allow China and third world states to con the rich countries into giving up their wealth and dominance, and now they must continue that growth project by rejecting communist demands for more restrictions on capital accumulation, dwarfing those associated with climate governance. Particularly telling in this respect is Bolsonaro's sorry not sorry justification for opposing social distancing measures. He said, "I'm sorry, some people will die, they will die, that's life. You can't stop a car factory because of traffic deaths." This acknowledges that business as usual involves the state in legislating for a certain bandwidth of acceptable death arising from capitalist production. It allows us to see that the social Darwinist passions of disaster nationalism and their ideological sociophobia, which is coterminous with their catastrophilia, are extractions from, distillations of, ordinary capitalist culture. And that's among the reasons why the behavior of capitalist states not led by nationalist forces hasn't always been much better than those led by nationalist forces. Finally, I want to argue for, on a subjective level, the salience of death denial in this form of politics. Of course, Freud famously argued that unconsciously none of us believes in our mortality. And both Trump and Bolsonaro have attempted to embody this denial at various points by claiming that the virus was just a bit of flu, that if they got ill, they wouldn't be very badly affected. And then, having both gotten ill, and even helped spread the virus in doing so, it didn't seem to hurt them either politically or in the long run, biologically. Trump, when he came out of hospital, had a plan, apparently, to rip off his shirt and display a Superman t-shirt underneath. That was his style of death denial. And although he wasn't able to carry out that stunt because his advisors begged him not to do it, it paid off. Trump's vote increased above his 2016 shares. I mean, let's be clear, Trump added more than 10 million votes to his total. He increased his vote share in many of the swing states, but he increased his vote share above his 2016 totals in counties where COVID deaths were highest. We often hear about the apocalyptic energies of the end times evangelicals. Disaster nationalism took courts, fears, is enthralled by, is aroused against, desires, wills on the end, an end whose instrument is the unimpeded, unconstrained cult of eternal accumulation, which we call capitalism.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'm still intrigued, and I'm also very happy how these two papers really talk to each other in various ways. Before we open up the floor for questions and comments, we have one more commentator, Manuela Boyachiev. She's a professor of European ethnology at the Humboldt University in Berlin, and also a member of the Cultures of Rejection research team. Manuela, your comments, please.
Yes, thank you so much. My role, I see my role much more in trying to summarize a little bit what I have heard, and maybe give a first attempt at structuring it, and then open to the discussion. And I will definitely not do truth to whatever has been said so far, which I have also no intention to repeat. But I think that when I prepared for this and I expected, certain ideas would arise and come up, then one way to go about it is, of course, to try and understand as it happens, that it is quite unclear how extended the crisis after the pandemic will be. So we don't really know yet what kind of crisis or how extended the crisis will be and for whom in particular. What we definitely know is that we will be faced with a very different world. And if I understand all of your comments that you made and introductory remarks, then it was the attempt to, first of all, try to grasp as a description and an observation what we can see at the moment that may sketch or highlight in one way or the other what will come. And of course, this attempt at, as Birgit also said, in trying to come up with a conjunctural analysis is, of course, always incomplete. So one of the questions that I may have to you and the audience is also that from what you have heard now, from listening to each other, what would you say is something that we still need to understand? What are the questions that are arising, rather than maybe the answers that we can gesture at? And you have certainly given a lot of them. When I listened to you, then what I have heard was that what we are facing at the moment is articulated in the voice and in the language of freedom, that people are raising concerns about the unprecedented abolition or shutdown of fundamental and seemingly irrevocable rights. It's the right to meet, the right to assemble, the right to be mobile. A lot of rights have been taken away from us. And this has been, as Eva has beautifully showed, has been articulated in a critique as a critique using the language of freedom. And I think this is something that hints to it, that in some ways hints us to an observation that we all had, I think, for at least 20 years now, and that I think we can very well see how it has proliferated and how it has actually changed our lives. So from a changing discourse actually to a very different changing reality that we face. And this is the appropriation, I would say, of the language of the left, and where it has been used in a more liberal way, something that you have all outlined, and this is that it has always and ever been part of something that is its reversed, it creates its reversed meaning. And I think this trying to understand the oscillation between certain languages that seem to had a meaning and have lost this meaning, and in the way it has been appropriated by the right, is something that in all your different accounts has been articulated. This is one thing. I think the other thing that I thought was really interesting, as well as in the way you have similarly articulated it, but also in the way you have had different accounts of it, was the question that was raised initially from Stefan, when he said that what we can observe within the pandemic is a certain way of renationalization, of an understanding of what Eva outlined as the idea of self-ownership in terms of freedom, in relation to what Stefan has called my people, or what Richard has called disaster nationalism. So a certain way in which these ideas of the self related to a certain group of people has been re-articulated, I think, in a new way. And I think if you speak, Richard, of a disaster nationalism, then the question arises, and the same question arises, I think, in terms of what Eva said, what is the new quality of that nationalism? Because of course, it is very different to the nationalism that we knew before. It's not just a going back to nationalism. It's not just a going back to the idea of self-ownership. It's a different idea of the way we articulate ourselves in relation to the social. And I think and this will be my last point, and I think what was quite interesting in your account, Richard, was that, and I'm not sure how you meant that, but what I thought was really interesting is that you seem to have a new diagnosis when you say that there is a different distinction of friends and enemies that we can observe in the current political conjuncture. And this is not only in the way friends and enemies are articulated as such, but in the way we see or we understand what a friend is and what an enemy might be. And you all said that all of this is, and so that if we put it in a certain language, that the way people subjectify or how processes of subjectification are happening at the moment in this oscillating relation between friend and enemy, the distinction is not so much the common feature anymore, and this is how I understood you, but more to keep this open in order to organize space for a right-wing politics that will actually be able to define who the enemy and who the friend is. So rather than thinking that we already are in that situation, what we are trying to understand at the moment is this particular transformation in which the enemy and the friend is still left open and has to be left open for a right-wing politics to be successful. Okay, so this is very, very, very little response, but maybe something to begin with.
Thanks so much, Manuela. Thanks to all of you for allowing this fascinating conversation to happen, really. At this point now we have 30 minutes left for discussion, for questions. So to all of you listening to us and watching us, you can, if you like, just type in your questions in the chat, or there's also a Q&A or F&R button on the bottom right of your screen, where you can just type in your questions. And if you would rather speak to us, you can also indicate that by just writing something, and we will then open your mics. So while you think about what you would like to ask or comment on, perhaps we could use the time to go back to Eva and Richard to briefly react to each other and to Manuela's comments. Eva, I will let you open your camera in just in a bit. All right. You should be able to activate your camera now. Yes.
Hello. I'm very sorry. I was attentively listening to everything. I just thought while I put wood on the stove, I switched off my video and then it never came back on. Sorry for that. Okay. So my head is full with stuff that would be worth discussing, and I think I might try to respond. Maybe there's a way in which I can address at the same time Manuela's interesting question about what the new quality of the nationalism we're witnessing, and also like her opening question, what the new quality, what the world we might live into at the end or the continuation of this crisis might look like, with my question to Richard, because so if this account of phantom possession and the defense of phantom possession, and also the fascist self-defense of phantom possession, so the installment of lost and amputated forms of historical control, if that is the animating drive of a lot of authoritarianism and right-wing politics that we see today, then it actually isn't so surprising, though I completely agree with the puzzle, that we didn't see any right-wing nationalist leaders impose stark sanctions. And I mean, Orban tried it a bit, and to use the state of emergency to have a big kind of fascist sovereign emerge, but instead go for this completely like let the virus run wild through the population, the nihilistic approach to pandemic control. And I think I would say that the current authoritarian drive post neoliberalism is one that is very individualized, and where it's not about, like, for instance, as it was in Germany after the First World War, that was about a lost collective phantom possession. It was the Treaty of Versailles and the lost regions, and then there was this kind of big nationalist fervor that was around a collective phantasma. And I would say now we see much more this sort of individual entitlement, for instance, in types of right-wing libertarians, white supremacist militias, or the incel fascism, where individual men think they should have a right to reappropriate access to women and basically get away with rape. That is kind of one of the key energies behind right-wing politics at the moment. And then it wouldn't be so surprising that there isn't the kind of big state and the collective control of the health of the population comes back, also because the health of the population in a fascist register, of course, is always the health of the healthy part of the population, and not of the weak part. There's sort of not this idea of solidarity that we have in the left discourse. And maybe that would also, and for Richard, I would just need to hear again, because I completely agree with that analysis of disaster nationalism, whether you really think that just maps onto kind of capitalist death drive, or whether there are also like contradictions between those two apocalyptic projects, as it were, that we are at the moment involved in. Because in itself, I think that disaster nationalism could also be a war nationalism. And so then the question remains why it isn't. But I also agree that the apocalyptic politics of Christian fundamentalism has a big role in that. So anyway, but for just one more thing to Manuela, you said keeping the distinction between friend and enemy open. I think that again would not be so surprising if we don't think of a collective body and a nationalist project that needs one enemy group to consolidate itself as a collective, but more as a bunch of kind of entitled individuals running amok who can turn against whoever at that moment seems to be their enemy. And I mean, in Germany, we had this clear list, right? That was post 1915, and especially post-Cologne, there was this whole wave of anti-migrant sentiment. Even before that, already since 2013, we had the anti-gender campaigns. Now it's the kind of anti-lockdown, anti-Drosten. And so in each of those waves, like whatever bothered the individual sort of entitled subjects turned them into the enemy. And I mean, the frightening aspect of that is that keeping the category of the enemy open is, of course, one of the characteristics, not of nationalism, but of totalitarianism, according to Hannah Arendt, that you need to have that. You need to always be able to fill in a new group as enemy. And I mean, Trump has been very clever also in having this whole construct with the anarchists and the Antifa as a very empty signifier, where whoever you don't like, it's not you're not attacking one group of people who can then claim discrimination, but you're making up this kind of slot that you can fit in whoever you want to fight. So yeah, that's a very dark picture of what the world might look like. But I think in general, I mean, my biggest worry is that the world doesn't even look very different than before, and that would be bad enough.
Thanks, Eva. With this outlook, I'll pass it on to Richard.
A few things, I suppose. With regard to the sort of thrust of contemporary authoritarianism, I think that the idiom of right libertarianism, of freedom and so on, and its related forms of sociophobia are indeed sort of anchored in a kind of post-neoliberal ideological terrain. However, I just want to point up the continuities as well, because there. I mean, I don't think it's that that this has supplanted the idea of the lost collective. I think that's still there, but it's shifted somewhat in its configurations. Look, historically, fascism gained popular support well ahead of delivering any material advantages to those who were its supposed beneficiaries. And that psychological improvement that they experienced was really the restoration of ontological self-confidence, which had been threatened and shattered through the experience of supremacy. And since you mentioned the MRAs and their assumption of the right to rape and to harass women and so on, I mean, one really thinks here of the spirit of D'Annunzio and the way that is manifested through Trump and Berlusconi and Duterte, you know, like this sort of gangster sexuality. But that in itself has in the background a kind of anxiety, a sexual anxiety about biological disaster. Hitler used to expostulate about, in his terms, bow-legged Jewish bastards. But that, you know, and, you know, raping Jewish girls, seducing Jewish girls, all of that stuff. These days, you've got the idea of being, you know, cucked by powerful black men, Romanian migrants, Chads, Mexicans, the Chinese, trans women, lesbians, anybody, essentially. And of course, in India, the meme is sort of a Romeo jihad. Romeo jihad, wherein Muslims will come and seduce your good young Hindu girl and convert her to the cause of Islam. And so the sort of the response to that sexual anxiety has always been a version of what the Nazis called Kraft durch Freude. I'm sure you could pronounce it better than me. But the idea of erotic pleasure as a principle of supremacy. And I think that that is also implicated in the sort of allure of catastrophe. I mean, one thing we can say about disaster nationalism, as I'm calling it, is that it doesn't thrive on the basis of the old golden rule, it's the economy stupid, because the economy can go very badly, governments can screw it up. Modi didn't do a great job in terms of his reign, didn't do very much for anybody, but he got re-elected with a sizable increase in his share of the vote. And Trump, despite being defeated, he expanded his base quite significantly into demographics that were thought to be inaccessible to him. So what is this coming out of? What is the offer? Well, Modi, you remember, really started to thrive electorally after the Gujarat pogrom. Like literally the year after, BJP votes in all of those seats soared. And I think essentially, you know, I mean, he was going around doing speeches saying there are these Muslims who want to do us down. but we're going to have the self-confidence and the unity to stand above them, etc. So this is the way in which the so-called friend-enemy distinction operates. I mean, it's never, you know, if you read the original Schmittian iteration of it, the enemy is never somebody who has any particular characteristics, who deserves to be made an enemy and to be treated as such, but is just a blank slate, you know, or a placeholder. And I think that that's, you know, that means that it's incredibly malleable. And I suppose the last question I was supposed to answer was, what is new about disaster nationalism? Well, in a way, not that much. I think that disaster nationalism is a propensity or a tendency that has always been in nationalism. You can go back to the earliest articulations of nationalism, and you find that there's implicit in it the idea of a kind of cosmic reset in favor of white male dominance, or whatever it happens to be at the time. I think that that has always been a propensity there, and it's the ambivalent relationship to disaster that I want to point up here. It's not just, you know, oh, let's bring on the chaos. It's let's bring on the chaos with the ostensible objective of refounding civilization on, you know, an embattled civilization, a civilization that's under threat by leftist terrorists or whatever, on the basis of something that is presumed to be traditional. So in a way, that's not quite new. What I suppose is new is that we are facing actual disasters of a life-ending scale. The pandemic is just a sort of an expression of the disaster that's befalling us, which is, of course, climate change, and the commitment of people to the individual liberty that is intrinsically embedded within petro-modernity, within the idea, you know, which of course is very appealing to Republicans, that, you know, your freedom is linked to your automobility, your ability to drive away from city blight, from urban poverty, and to live in the sort of exurbia or rural enclaves or whatever, and to be free from taxation, free from the federal government and all the rest of it. I think that the climate disaster does add a particular wrinkle to it, and does foreground and has been part of the essential context in which denialism and the industries of denialism and the techniques of denialism and the surrounding conspiracist paranoia and ideologies of citizen investigation have come to the fore. Sorry, that's quite a lot. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. Stefan, Manuela, Birgit, would you like to weigh in at this point? With more comments, questions?
I may just add something to this question of friend and enemy, and I think what you have said now is something that I think we all observe at the moment, and this is that there's, to a certain extent, the enemy is this open signifier. It is malleable, as you said. It is, but what I think is really surprising is the half-life that it has. So it seemed that for quite a long time, the enemy that, you know, in whichever flexible relation it has been constructed, had a certain continuity. It was a certain group. It stayed this group. It was helpful to have this group. It was organized as the other, as us and the other. And this maybe it's just the rhythm of its changing. Maybe it is the flexibilization of these different enemies. But there's also one other feature that I find interesting, and this is that in this construction of enemy and friends, there's also been a relation that was always thought of as inferior and superior. But the way at the moment that we can observe in which way those who think of themselves as friends construct themselves as inferior and imagine the other, the enemy, as superior, and then act out all these disastrous nationalist ways of organizing themselves, that is something that I find puzzling and at the same time quite interesting. Okay, so this is a performance. This is a way to organize yourself, and this has always been a certain construct in the way, for example, racism has worked, in which you say, okay, then there is this whole wave of immigrants coming in, and then we will cease to exist, etc., etc. So that idea has always been part of it. But would it be wrong to say that this has become more than just a way of functioning or a mode of functioning of that distinction, but rather one of its main features?
Yeah.
Thank you, Manuela. So at this point, you probably would just have to raise your hand and or just go ahead and talk. Stefan?
Oh, well, I want to thank you all for these really interesting ideas and interventions. And one thing that comes, I mean, one question, two questions for me put in very broad terms. I mean, what would be, I mean, what is the kind of the channels and the lines of support or but also lines of dissent between what I was talking about, which is not disaster nationalism in the way you talked about it, but in the way that it becomes acceptable to become it becomes acceptable for the political establishment and for mainstream media to go nationalist and to disregard. I mean, to in a self-evident way, put the national community, the national biopolitic first. Before the Danes, before the Norwegians, I'm speaking from a Swedish standpoint, that even in the face of this pandemic, the own population then is the most important one, and you don't even have to argue for it. And then the internal differentiation within that population. Which is where racism plays in. That there is of course certain parts then of this national population which are expendable, who could die. So there is a kind of authoritarian nationalist mindset conquering also the minds of policy, or not the minds of policy, but seeping into policy and seeping into mainstream media discourse in this. That's one thing that I'm asking myself. And then there is this: what is the relationship when we are talking about this between the enemy? I mean, the Schmittian enemy here, and the lives which are expendable and can't be mourned, to use Butler's phrase, the indifference toward the death of certain populations. I mean, is that the enemy? No, but how do these relate?
Thank you, Stefan. We have a little more than 5 minutes left, so I suggest we give Richard and Eva the chance to briefly comment on these last points again before we wrap it up. If that's okay for everyone. Then Eva, if you would like to start.
Sure. So
yeah.
Wow, then I have to already start thanking for the good debate while I'm still totally in it. So I know that I partly brought it up, but I think I want to steer back on the idea that the enemy is an empty signifier or just a placeholder, because and even in Butler's sort of talk about who can be mourned, who can't be mourned, I think in a way that's somewhat lazy social theory. Like if you look at the history of, and I mean, that's fine, Judith does other great things, but if you look at the genealogy of like our societies, our political economies, the way that modern identities were formed, then you can see clear patterns, as it was said in the introduction, of certain groups being rendered non-owners, indigenous people, colonized people, other people being rendered objects of property, especially Black enslaved people, then next groups being partially propertized, women, and of course every worker propertized with regard to labor power. So, and those ideological objects have been woven into our material economy, like since the get-go, I would argue. So it's not, there isn't a puzzle that people become fascist before they have a material gain from whatever the motorway being built. It's, they have the type of symbolic gain that they have is real and has material consequences. And I want to kind of steal from Richard the wonderful formulation of the restoration of ontological security, because we need a vocabulary, I think, that avoids the talk just of privilege of certain identities, because we need to point out that what they are trying to claim is a title of domination that helps them shield their dependency and helps them shield their anxiety and their precarity, or whatever registered vulnerabilities you want to use. But it's still phantasmatic. It functions, but it's not founded. And I mean, that's why because it is self-undermining, it has to tip into violence. And I think the interesting thing that we have nowadays is that our economy has also partially moved away from needing the traditional institutionalized forms of oppression, while of course there is still sexism and racism, but they function differently as in a plantation economy. But the compensation for precarity still is traded in the form of those phantasmatic entitlements. So everyone who fits the mold of former property needs to be subjugated for someone to feel superior. That's the one class of enemy, those that are propertized. Or that's more the class of victim. And then there's a class of enemy, which is whoever comes to interfere with that subjugation. And that can be, you know, the Jews, the gender studies, feminist scholars, or whoever. It's empty in that, of course, you can construe a new group, but it's not random, and that it fulfills a certain position in the map of social identities, as it were. So I just, I don't know, I wanted to throw that in there because I actually think it's fascinating to study how every kind of surge of authoritarianism infuses this grid with a kind of new level of abstraction and new constellation, but it's not a random one. I know nobody said it is random one, but yeah, you know, restoring ontological security. That's what authoritarianism tries to do.
Thanks so much, Eva. Richard, before you start, we just received a question from the audience that I would like to read to you because it is addressed to you. I'm not sure if you can see it, but I'll just read it out loud. So it says, I find your notion of disaster nationalism very illuminating and would like to ask if you see the denialism of right-wing leaders, Trump, etc., as a way of paradoxically remaining on the side of the true people in opposition to the imagined leftist, feminist, globalist elite. Since this imagined enemy is more or less implicit, connected to the other enemies, quote unquote, migrants, queers, etc., the denial is thus working against others in a double sense. If you could perhaps give us your final comments and also maybe touch upon this as well.
Yeah, well, I can be very brief with the question. I think that's right. Keith Kahn Harris has written a good book about denialism, which essentially treats it as a form of dark desire. You know, we all know the phenomenon of denial in our personal lives. If you don't want to give up smoking, and the doctor says you're going to die if you don't give up smoking, well, you might tell yourself, I'm not going to die, and go out and continue smoking. In the same way, if you want to continue to enjoy going to the pub and you're not that bothered about the elderly perishing, you might tell yourself, oh, it's not that serious. They're making a big fuss of it. In other words, dark desire is implicated in this in the same way that it's implicated in climate denial or in denial about the scope of sexism, for example. You know, there's an investment in certain things. I could go on. Look, in terms of what was said by Manuela about, you know, the interesting way in which we are supposedly we're constructing, we friends, if we can put it like that, are constructing ourselves in a position of inferiority vis-a-vis the enemy. I think that's very perceptive and precise, but I wonder if it wasn't also always true up to a point with phenomena like anti-Semitism. You know, there was always a complicated inferiority / superiority. But if I may bring it up to date, I think if you look at the ideology of the MRAs and the incels, their Chad Stacey ideology, the ideology that there's someone out there getting a maximum amount of sexual satisfaction, and it's these good-looking Chads and Stacys. And if you look at their practices of blackpilling, where you write letters, notes to yourself, bullying yourself, telling yourself that you're unattractive, that you're ugly, and you've got a small chin, and you'll never ever attract any woman ever in your life. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing that is actually not only a condoned practice within that community, but it's actually quite addictive. Those who do it will tell you that there's something compulsive about that dark obsession with being inferior. There is obviously, whenever we're talking about sexuality, an attraction to what is transgressive and shameful and self-injuring and so on. And finally, I just wanted to make this point. In terms of the friend-enemy distinction, I do think we have to make a distinction between those who are, let's say, regarded as troublemakers and problematic by the authorities and by right-wing ideologies and so on, and the enemy per se. I think the enemy occupies a very specific place because, don't forget, this comes out of theology. I mean, that's why Schmidt was very clear. He's writing political theology. The enemy is the devil. The enemy is Satan. This is medieval demonology. You can go back and read the demonological tracts from the witch hunters of the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. That's where this comes from. And so it is, in one sense, a placeholder, but I think it might be usefully interrogated through the prism of psychoanalysis, you know, because there's an idea here of a false master, you know. The idea that essentially what's going on here is that the Jews or the communists, and there's a sort of a fusion of the two in that imaginary, are a false master, a phony master, you know, the cosmopolitanists, the globalists, and essentially, you know, Nazi ideology, fascist ideology, anti-Semitic ideology was always that the Jews are a derivative race. That they are, you know, they're aspiring to be a master race, but they copy all their best stuff from white culture, from Aryan culture. And that was always the ideology. So I think that it might be worth interrogating the ideology of the enemy, particularly when we start thinking about how they talk about Muslims and the idea of Islamization. When they start talking about China and the idea of, you know, Chinese style communism taking over, I think there's a very similar kind of logic going on there. Anyway, I've got on. I'll leave it there. Thank you all.
Thank you, Richard, and thanks to all of the participants. I think this was, I would like to think of this as part of an ongoing conversation that pops up on different places, and I'm very, very glad that our research group was able to become one of the nodes and one of the spaces, even if it's just virtual, where this kind of conversation happens. And I hope and I'm confident that we will be able to continue this in various and different places. So again, I'd like to thank you as presenters and commentators. I would like to thank all the people listening in and watching us. And just two more things. Well, first of all, check out the writings of Richard and Eva and Stefan and Birgit and Manuela that you will find.
And Benny's.
And if you like mine as well. Yeah. The only downside to this role today is that I have like 15 or 25 questions that I would have loved to raise, but this is not what my role was today. Anyways, also, if you're interested in the project and what we're doing, you can always check out the website that I've mentioned. And also, just as it happens by coincidence, this very day, a brief article that we wrote collectively on cultures of rejection in the COVID-19 crisis was published online by Ethnic and Racial Studies. You can go and read it on the website. It's open access. And just finally, I would like to thank two people who you haven't seen today, but who have done incredibly important work. That is Anna Hasenauer and Florian Zeller, who made sure that things actually work and are well organized. So thanks, everyone. Have a very pleasant evening, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.